You are drowning in a sea of connections, yet you have never felt more desperately alone. You refresh your feed, hunting for a red notification dot like a starving dog begging for scraps. You think you are socializing, but you are not. You are willingly locking yourself inside a digital slaughterhouse. Let us begin with a fundamental biological truth. Your fear of isolation is not a personal failing, it is a neurological fossil. Hundreds of thousands of years ago, on the ancestral savanna, solitary hominids did not survive. Separation from the tribe meant inevitable death by starvation or predation. To ensure survival, the human brain evolved a brilliant, ruthless mechanism. It equated social isolation with physical agony. When you feel lonely, the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, the exact same neural circuitry that processes the pain of a broken bone, flares into action. You do not merely feel sad when disconnected. Biologically, you feel as though you are dying. You are operating on Pleistocene hardware. And the architects of the modern digital landscape know this intimately. The technology conglomerates of our era are not communication enterprises, they are behavioral engineering firms. They have mapped the evolutionary vulnerabilities of the human limbic system and weaponized your primitive survival instincts against you. They recognize that your brain is hardwired to seek tribal validation, to scan the environment constantly for signs of social inclusion or exclusion. Thus, they constructed the ultimate, inescapable Skinner box. In the mid-20th century, B.F. Skinner demonstrated that a rat placed in an operant conditioning chamber would pull a lever obsessively if rewarded with food on a variable ratio schedule, meaning the reward is unpredictable. Today, your smartphone is the lever, and you are the rat. Every notification ping, every red badge, every vibrating alert is a carefully calibrated artificial reward stimulus designed to trigger a dopamine spike in your nucleus accumbens. You do not check your device out of genuine curiosity or a desire for meaningful connection. You check it because your neurochemistry has been hijacked. You are caught in a relentless dopamine loop, frantically pressing the lever to stave off the evolutionary terror of being left behind by the digital tribe. This is the trap of hyperstimuli. In nature, rewards require immense effort and yield proportionate physiological satisfaction. In the engineered ecosystem of the screen, rewards are instantaneous, frictionless, and utterly void of actual social sustenance. They provide just enough dopaminergic reinforcement to keep the behavioral loop intact, but never enough to satiate the underlying evolutionary need. You are force-fed empty social calories, leaving you in a state of perpetual, ravenous malnutrition. Observe your own behavior in a quiet room. The moment stillness settles, the moment the artificial stimuli cease, panic initiates. Your brain misinterprets the silence as exile. Your hand twitches toward the glass screen, desperate for the artificial validation that assures you the tribe has not abandoned you. You are not a sovereign individual making conscious choices, you are an organism reacting to engineered behavioral conditioning, a prisoner perfectly adapted to love its cage. Isolation is not a tragic byproduct of the modern era, it is a deliberately engineered prerequisite for exponential economic growth. You exist within a socio-economic architecture designed to systematically sever authentic communal bonds, replacing them with a pervasive, sanitized hyper-individualism. As obligate social primates, humans possess a neurological imperative for connection. When this imperative is starved, the psyche enters a state of acute distress. The modern market does not attempt to resolve this distress, it weaponizes it. A self-sufficient, deeply connected community is economically stagnant. A lonely, isolated individual, however, is an infinitely exploitable resource. Thus, your loneliness is not a personal failure, it is a highly lucrative commodity. When the social brain is subjected to starvation, it desperately seeks the psychological equivalent of empty calories. Corporations act as the architects of your synthetic salvation, offering manufactured digital intimacy as a universal panacea. Parasocial relationships with influencers, algorithmic echo chambers, and the gamification of social approval serve as highly processed, nutrient-void social interactions. They trigger just enough dopamine release to prevent total psychological collapse, but carefully withhold genuine satiation. They keep you perpetually hungry. You are prescribed a digital placebo to treat a neurosocial deficit that the market itself created. This is the commodification of intimacy, selling you the antidote to a poison they pump into your environment daily. The behavioral conditioning is entirely transparent. A psychologically grounded, fulfilled human being has minimal utility to a consumption-driven economy. They do not require retail therapy. They do not require endless subscriptions to digital distractions. In stark contrast, the lonely individual utilizes consumption as a primary coping mechanism to anesthetize the void. The acquisition of material goods, the compulsive consumption of hyperstimulating, low-value content, and the purchasing of artificial companionship are all frantic, neurologically driven attempts to self-medicate. The system requires you to remain fundamentally hollow, because the attempt to fill that bottomless void guarantees continuous, unbroken economic participation. From a clinical standpoint, you are trapped in a Skinner box of your own psychological bleeding. The market monetizes your despair, aggressively conditioning you to believe that the next transaction, the next swipe, or the next fabricated parasocial interaction will finally close the psychological wound. It is a biological impossibility. The Stoic imperative demands a ruthless intellectual audit of your behavioral loops. You must recognize the commercialization of your despair. Stop attempting to numb the existential void with commercial anesthetics. The immediate prescription is not to seek out more synthetic connections, but to endure the agonizing discomfort of your own isolation. Sit with the withdrawal symptoms. Reject the algorithmic pacifier. To reclaim your psychological autonomy, you must first accept that your chronic loneliness is the exact mechanism by which they extract your capital. Starve the system by refusing to consume the cure. Only when the artificial noise is silenced can genuine, unmonetized human connection be forged. The diagnosis is absolute, your baseline neurochemistry is shattered. We have mapped the architecture of your behavioral sink in the previous phase. Now, we initiate the clinical intervention. The cure is not a gentle weaning, it is an abrupt, brutal severance of the artificial supply. Welcome to the dopamine detox. Understand the neurological reality of this severance. Your brain's reward circuitry, specifically the mesolimbic pathway, has been downregulated by chronic exposure to hyperstimuli. Receptors are blunted. When you strip away the algorithmic pacifiers, you will not immediately feel clarity. You will experience a severe neurochemical crash. The sudden deficit of exogenous dopamine will plunge your system into acute withdrawal. Your brain will scream for equilibrium, manufacturing phantom vibrations in your pocket, inducing an agonizing restlessness, and weaponizing boredom into sheer terror. This is not a malfunction, this is the physiological cost of homeostasis attempting to reassert itself. To survive this biological screaming, we turn to the rigid discipline of Stoicism, specifically the framework of Seneca. Seneca understood that to immunize oneself against the tyranny of pleasure, one must practice voluntary discomfort. Premeditatio malorum applied to neurobiology. You must not merely tolerate the agony of withdrawal, you must intellectually embrace it as the exact mechanism of your salvation. The anxiety, the cold sweats of the disconnected mind, the visceral urge to swipe, scroll, and consume, these are the symptoms of parasites dying within your prefrontal cortex. Seneca wrote, "A gem cannot be polished without friction, nor a man perfected without trials." In the clinical context, the friction is the pain of sensory deprivation. This phase demands a brutal application of neural rewiring. Neuroplasticity is not a passive phenomenon, it is an aggressively active biological process forged in the crucible of sustained discomfort. To rewire the neural pathways, you must repeatedly deny the limbic system its expected reward. Every time you stare into the agonizing void of a silent room and refuse to reach for the screen, you force the brain to forge new synaptic connections. You are violently pruning the dendritic spines grown by the algorithms. The Stoic shield is your cognitive defense mechanism during this rewiring. When the amygdala panics in the absence of stimuli, the Stoic shield, the rational, observing self, remains impassive. You observe the craving as a detached clinician observing a rat in a maze. You do not negotiate with the craving. You let the urge peak, plateau, and eventually decay. This is the agonizing, necessary violence of self-reclamation. You will endure the silence until the baseline resets, until the world regains its natural color, and until you are no longer a manipulated variable in a tech conglomerate's behavioral experiment. The social ecosystem surrounding you is rarely a symbiotic construct. From an evolutionary perspective, human aggregation operates on a strict economy of cognitive exchange. When the psychological output you provide consistently exceeds the reciprocal investment, you are no longer participating in a relationship, you are actively hosting a parasite. This is the pathology of the modern paradigm. You tolerate behavioral leeches because your primal mammalian attachment system has been systematically hijacked by an irrational fear of tribal isolation. You have been conditioned to perceive parasitic drain as social obligation. To reclaim your psychological sovereignty, we must initiate a behavioral extinction protocol. In clinical conditioning, an extinction burst occurs when a previously reinforced behavior is abruptly deprived of its reward. The social parasite will thrash. They will demand explanations and attempt to exploit your guilt-responsive dopamine loops. You must provide zero reinforcement. This necessitates the immediate installation of hard boundaries. A hard boundary is not a negotiation or an apology, it is an impenetrable behavioral firewall. It is the irrevocable cessation of all stimulus response mechanisms. You do not explain your departure to a malignant tumor before surgical intervention. You simply excise it. The execution protocol must be mechanical, ruthless, and devoid of sentimentality. Obliterate their digital footprint from your reality. Block the cellular numbers. Sever all social media vectors instantly. Unfriend, block, and delete without warning. Digital platforms are engineered as continuous intermittent reinforcement schedules. Keeping a parasitic entity in your periphery allows a cognitive pathogen to metastasize. Burn the bridge and salt the earth. For entities in your physical proximity, neutralize engagement completely. Adopt the gray rock psychological defense mechanism. Become categorically non-responsive, devoid of emotional effect, flat in vocal tone, and utterly uninteresting. Starve their dopamine receptors until they detach to seek a more pliable host. Understand this clinical reality: the permanent removal of social garbage is a surgical procedure performed entirely without anesthesia. It will hurt. You will inevitably experience the neurological equivalent of phantom limb syndrome. Your brain, conditioned to anticipate the chaotic stimuli of the parasitic dynamic, will trigger a neurochemical withdrawal sequence. Cortisol levels will spike. The compulsion to seek an illusory closure will be intense. Recognize this merely as neurochemical homeostasis struggling to adapt to a sudden deficit of familiar toxicity. Do not flinch. Endure the psychological withdrawal. Closure is a cinematic myth, empirical reality requires only amputation. Every parasitic attachment you sever liberates cognitive bandwidth, reallocating neurological resources toward your own psychological architecture. Excising the tumor is not an act of cruelty, it is the ultimate expression of Stoic self-preservation. You are not losing companions. You are curing a systemic infection. The neurological reset is complete. The acute withdrawal phase, the panicked flailing of a limbic system starved of its synthetic dopamine, has entirely burned out. What remains is not a void, but a profound, structural silence. Physiologically, your receptor densities have normalized. You no longer require the artificial friction of digital notifications, the simulated tribal validation, or the algorithmic drip feed to sustain baseline consciousness. The prefrontal cortex has reclaimed absolute dominance over the mammalian brain. You have successfully uninstalled the malware of external dependence. In the modern paradigm, solitude is strictly pathologized because the attention economy collapses without your persistent anxiety. They conditioned you to interpret isolation as a sensory deprivation tank, a punishment to be avoided at all costs. But as the neurochemical fog clears, the architecture shifts. Isolation is no longer a prison, it crystallizes into a fortress of solitude. By deliberately severing the feedback loops of societal expectation, you have neutralized the operant conditioning that kept you compliant. You stop performing the exhaustive theater of identity. You cease to be a consumable asset. True psychological freedom is inherently clinical. It is the absolute absence of the physiological need to be perceived. The evolutionary imperative to secure tribal approval, driven by the primal terror of ostracization, is merely a vestigial reflex. You have now surgically excised it. An independent mind demands no external validation because it accurately categorizes public opinion as raw, low-quality data. The judgments of the herd are just fluctuating metrics generated by deeply compromised, emotionally dysregulated observers. Their applause is neurologically meaningless, their condemnation is biologically irrelevant. Why would a sovereign entity calibrate its internal state to the chaotic variables of a sick society? You have transitioned into the monolith. A psychological structure of absolute density, stripped of all porous vulnerabilities. You no longer leak cognitive energy into the digital ether. You do not react to the hyperstimuli explicitly engineered to provoke your outrage or harvest your empathy. When the environment attempts to extract an emotional response, it strikes solid rock and shatters. The behavioral scientists, the algorithm architects, the social engineers, they possess no metrics for a subject that flatly refuses to press the lever in the Skinner box. You have become entirely unquantifiable. This is the terminus of your psychological evolution. A total, calculated withdrawal from the marketplace of human frailty. You are no longer a reactive node in their hyperconnected network of neuroses. You are an autonomous entity, operating on an encrypted frequency they can neither intercept nor decode. The external world will inevitably continue to spin in its frantic, dopamine-starved psychosis. It will scream for your attention. Let it scream. You remain stationary, impermeable, unbreakable, cold, absolute.